All right, it is 6:03 PM and we will call our city council work session to order. We have one item on our agenda tonight. That is continued review and discussion of the 2024 estimated and 2025 proposed general fund budgets with an echo.
Okay, well, I will have an echo. We have to turn Robin's sound off. Hang on, let me go get her. Did we get it? Are we good? Oh, we're good. Thank you. Good evening. I don't have a PowerPoint this evening, so I don't know whether that is a combination of budget fatigue at this point in the process or the heat or a little bit of both. Really just wanted to spend some time kind of talking through some of the issues that were included in the memorandum. Again, this is a work in progress and will be a work in progress until we hit our August committee meeting. So it's one of the challenges, I think, of having to budget this far in advance of the beginning of your fiscal year. And, I can kind of whine about that a little bit, but every city in the state of Kansas is in exactly the same boat. But what we find for a city our size is that there's so many things that are in flux or in play in any particular year, that it feels like daily the numbers and revenues are changing. And whether that is trying to chase down what is our actual assessed valuation for budgeting purposes, or are we dealing with use tax refunds? Are we dealing with dark store theory refunds? What's going to happen in the labor market? What do we need to do to increase part-time salaries and wages? What are the things that are going to happen in an aging building that are going to need to be addressed more immediately? And so we're kind of at that point in the budget that happens, at least for me each year, where we're really trying to be as transparent and as both conservative and aggressive in meeting council and community goals at the same time. I know Justin and our HR specialist, Kathy Stratman, talked with our benefits broker this week. And because of our small group size, we will not have a final number for our health and welfare benefit plan until the 1st of October at the earliest. So they can talk to us about trend and we can, add percentage increases in the budget. And that's our best guess, but it will not be until we hit the 4th quarter of this year that we actually have those numbers. So there are a lot of things like that for us that just because of our size in many instances, we really want to try to be as responsive as we can to the needs of the department, to the needs of the citizens, to the needs of our businesses. But we have to be really careful in not being overly aggressive in revenue estimates, or committing to big capital expenditures before we know we're going to have those eggs in the basket or birds in the hand, if you will. So this evening, I would like to just kind of, as I mentioned, walk through some of the points included in the memo, some of the things that are still at play or beginning to settle, get some feedback on that. We still have things to solve for in the next few weeks, and we will continue to do that. But I thought that's the best way to probably spend our time this evening, see if there are other additional kind of questions, concerns as we work to really bring together at our July committee meeting the full budget. So we'll be bringing back the general fund, all of the other sort of additional funds that we haven't talked about yet. So the MCBB fund, transient guest tax, special alcohol, some of those smaller funds that have dedicated revenues and expenses, and then also marrying that up with the capital improvement program that we looked at a couple of months ago. So I think in the June 5th memo, so we have been able to sort of check one definitive box since we met on June 5th, and that is we have an actual number. for our final assessed valuation for 2023. I think we had mentioned in the last memo that there was a discrepancy between some numbers that were produced in November and then in March. We had a series of email exchanges with the county appraiser, and we didn't feel like we were getting a clear answer. So Justin and I paid the appraiser a visit. And I think the answer that we walked away with was the larger number is correct, and we have no idea where the number that we gave you in March came from. So, and then we also had confirmation because we received our official documents from the taxation department at the county that shows that final assessed valuation and projects revenue neutral rate and all those things for the budget. So we've squared that away, which was good because last time we talked, we were potentially facing about $100,000 loss in property tax revenues if that lower number had held true. So we feel comfortable with that. And so we will continue. We've adjusted those calculations in the budget materials and the general fund summary and revenue detail that was provided with this memo and this packet. So we are anticipating, and actually when we received that information from the Treasury and Taxation Department, our projected assessed valuation also went up slightly over the numbers that we were provided back in March. So we went from an estimated about 216 million to 223 million. So it gives us a little bit more kind of in that budget. And we were pretty much spot on in calculating, interestingly enough, that difference between the 208,000 that we thought we were starting with and 216, and the difference between 213 and 223 is about the same. So our revenue neutral rate calculation was fairly accurate. The county has confirmed that our revenue neutral rate, which you'll recall is the mill levy that would generate exactly the same amount of property tax that was generated this year, is 17.719 mills versus our current mill levy of 18.497. We have built the proposed 2025 budget at this point on holding the mill levy constant at that 8.497, which would require the city council to pass a resolution of intent at your July meeting so that we can notify the county by July 20th, and they can prepare the notices that go out to all the taxpayers in the county. And then you wouldn't actually vote on. So that is an intent. It signals an intent to do that. It does not commit you to that. You still will actually take a vote and set the mill levy in August when you adopt the final budget. We've tweaked a few other things on the revenue side, really nothing significant, with the exception of the 2025 budget. We have actually, we try to project plan review and inspection fees that will be generated by the larger development projects that may be in the pipeline. And Brian had provided information for several of those, which the Millhouse project, the Block project, 58th and Null, I think, and Mission Vale, which was showing in 2025 estimated revenues of about $900,000. The longer we sat with that number, the more uncomfortable we were in terms of leaving that in our base budget in the event that some of the one or more of those projects don't actually proceed. So we have actually backed out and backed that down by about $300,000, which we think that is a pretty consistent base if we look at the history of just other building permits that are issued. And then if we are successful in bringing those other projects in line in 2025, then we will have additional revenues that we'll be able to come back and discuss and talk about. But again, this is where it's sort of this balancing act of how conservative. I don't want to show it and spend it and then not capture it. So that was really settling the property tax issue and then making some adjustments, and those plan review and inspection fees were kind of the biggest issues that we dealt with on the revenue side since you saw these numbers on June 5th. On the expense side, we've talked around this for a couple of sessions, but what we're showing in the personnel line items that you have in front of you are a recommendation to consider shifting expenses for park maintenance out of the general fund and into either the Parks and Recreation Sales Tax Fund, or I need to do a little bit more research, could be the Special Parks Fund that is a third of the alcohol tax that we receive from the state distribution. So right now, those personnel costs between full-time and part-time staff are about $135,000. We were very intentional when we crafted the sales tax language for the first issue and the second time to allow for operating costs to be paid from sales tax revenues. In the first 10 years of the sales tax, we only spent $125,000 of that, all of those revenues generated over that 10-year period on operating costs. And that was the very first year, and there was a pretty large gap in cost recovery for the community center. And so there's some funds that were transferred to that. But then the council was very specific and very deliberate in saying, no, that money is to pay debt service on the MFAC renovation, and then to really start to catch us up on deferred maintenance at the community center for that first 10 years. For the second 10 years, we'd been through that conceptual park planning process. We knew we wanted to start making those investments in the outdoor park system. And I think that was much of what propelled us to an 86% voter approval on the renewal of that sales tax. But I think that, and so really, we are making great strides, as you well know, with the things that are happening in our parks now and planned over the next 10 years of that sales tax in the outdoor parks. But the piece that needs to come alongside of that, and you've heard the PRT talk about it, you've heard stakeholder groups as we talked about each of the park conceptual plans, that maintenance needs to be a really critical piece of what we do going forward. No sense investing $10 million in park amenities and then not investing the resources to take care of those. And so I think that, and I've talked with the mayor just briefly about, I think that it's probably wise for us, if that is a philosophy that we want to continue to subscribe to sort of begin to shift, and maybe it's not all of those expenses, but some of those to that park sales tax, so that when it comes time for potential renewal at the next cycle, that we're able to say, we've put these things in, we've been maintaining them in order to maintain all of our parks facilities to the same standard. So that's what's shown here, which has created a little bit of breathing room in the general fund budget. I'm still putting really fine pencil to paper to make sure we can shift all of those expenses. And that will be cleared up by the time we come back to you in July. But yes, Councilmember Green.
What have we done with the sales tax money that was put in place for that? And we only drew 125,000. Are those carryover items? Is the money carried over? What would?
So each year we allocate for either operating or capital expenses. So there wasn't anything that was apportioned. So there wasn't anything in the sales tax language that said X amount is for debt service, X amount is for capital, X amount is for operations. It was all sort of in one pot, and we had the flexibility to spend it. We didn't spend any the first 10 years except for the $125,000 on operating costs. So each year it was spent on debt service for the MFAC and for maintenance, primarily maintenance at the community center. And then just fund balances continued to sort of roll over. So I saw heads sort of nodding. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Oh yeah.
So in a potential renewal of the sales tax next go around, is it fair to say then that we probably wouldn't be looking at any kind of improvements or?
No, I don't think that's fair. I don't think you're ever going to get to, I mean, if you think about right now, you've got a 3/8 cent sales tax that is generating almost $1.2 million annually. I think you still have room for you're not ever going to spend all of that every year on maintenance of our amenities. So you will still be able to refresh. You want to be able to leave the flexibility to refresh and renew the things that we're investing in, whether that's the MFAC or continued investment. And the conversations that the mayor and I've had, and I know it's important to everyone, we don't want to slow down the progress that we have promised making in this 10-year period. again, if we're not able to shift all of it, or ultimately it's something the council wishes that you don't want to move forward with this at this time, I do think it makes sense for us to create a park maintenance division budget. So in your budget materials, we have a separate budget for the MFAC and one for the Powell Community Center. Right now, we're carrying those personnel costs for the park maintenance staff in the community center line item budget. So it inflates that budget. And if we're really looking at cost recovery for that facility, we need to pull back things that aren't directly related to that. And then we carry sort of the contractual expenses for park maintenance in the public works budget, because that's who did it, years and years and years ago. So I think if either way, we need to kind of pull those together so that we can have that really complete picture and be able to communicate and watch and project and manage those expenses more sort of comprehensively and intentionally. And so you'll see then in contractual expenses, consistent with the recommendation to shift personnel expenses for parks maintenance, we've also currently shifted that $75,000 in contractual park maintenance expenses to the sales tax for the same reasons outlined above. In the 2024 estimated budget on the expense side, we've made a couple of updates since June 5th to reflect the following capital expenses. So each year, when we get to the end of a fiscal year, if we have items that we've contracted for, that we've purchased, that we have not yet paid for, then we encumber those funds and they're committed to those particular projects. So those dollars don't roll back into our general fund balance to be spent on something else. So some of these numbers have been updated in the 2024 estimated to reflect, in the case of the general overhead, we had $80,000 that was budgeted this year for desktop and laptop replacement. And I believe, is it on this agenda? Okay, they all run together at this point. That we're moving forward with that. We have $75,000 quote for that. But then we had Wi-Fi access points and UPS that was authorized last year that are carrying over. So that increased that line item budget. So again, it's not new money. It's just pulling that money out of what rolled into fund balance at December 31st. Community development has an expense. We've transitioned for $1,500 to get iPads for the field staff. That helps really improve their efficiency as they are out and about. And then in the police department, a similar situation, we had the $140,000 Department of Justice grant for the automated license plate readers. Last year in the 2023 budget, we showed those grant revenues coming in and the expenditures going out, neither of which happened. Well, we had expenditures for the ALPRs in 2023, but none of the grant funds were received. And so that those roll over. Body and in-car cameras, which is a new business item on your agenda later this evening. And we didn't have a chance to talk about that really on June 5th. That had originally been submitted by the chief as a supplemental request for beginning in 2025 at about $53,000 a year. I think if you saw his action item, and he'll speak to that later this evening, we're seeing a deterioration. It's not that we have enough body cameras. It's just, we had originally purchased body cameras for each officer to have their own. And now they're sort of in a process of checking them out and charging and so we felt it was important really to accelerate that into this year. And then that's carried over. And then we had some e-ticketing hardware purchases that were approved last year and carried over. Yes.
What happened to the grant money?
The grant money's in. I mean, we've got it all
We did
reimbursed.
that.
We just didn't get it last year as a revenue. It's still there. And so that's why you see kind of, so we've trued up the actuals that are shown in the sheet that was in your packet yesterday have been trued up with the audit. So June 5th, we were working with pretty good numbers, but it's always sort of this balancing act to compare to the auditor's numbers. So you'll see there all of the true ins and outs from 2023. So, for example, we authorized Well, we knew we wanted to spend about $180,000 on the Johnson Drive landscape conversion to the natives. We couldn't encumber those funds because we didn't have a vendor that was selected until January or February of this year, but we've committed. So it's a little bit of having to move things and truing things up with what actually inflows and outflows in that particular year. And part of that has been more challenging in recent years because of supply chain issues or just delays in projects or trying to navigate Department of Justice websites to figure out how to submit for reimbursement and other things. The 2025 proposed budget at this point still only includes capital expenditures in the amount of $88,000, which reflects the required lease payment for tasers in the police department, which is year 2 of 5, and for a second year of the lease payment for replacement of the in-car cameras. We talked a little bit at the June 5th committee meeting that we had had a meeting with, or having a meeting, I think the next day actually, with Enterprise Mobility to look at sort of leasing options. We had that meeting. We've had a follow-up meeting where they've presented some of the data. We're still working through those costs. I think there's some opportunities for us to have savings, but we don't have kind of our final recommendation for vehicles put together yet, but we will get that firmed up prior to the July 10th meeting. And that would exclude heavy equipment, but would include everything from kind of regular vehicles at the community development, small SUVs that the community development department is driving, all the police vehicles, and up to a 250? Up to 450, F-450 trucks in the Public Works Department, but they wouldn't do like the 1-ton dump trucks and street sweepers and things like that. So again, beyond the addition of the body and in-car cameras for the police department, we haven't put any capital or supplemental expenditures in either the 24 estimated or 25 proposed. We had provided that list of kind of all of the supplemental requests when we met on the 5th of June. I had shortened that list up. I gave you the full list again with this packet, but then shortened that up as we've talked through as department directors and kind of really looking at what are the highest priority and what we think we reasonably have some chance of funding. So I want to come back and cover that. But before we come back to the supplemental list, I would like to just talk a little bit about a potential change in how we look at and consider our general fund balance or reserve policy. So currently, there's a city council policy which says that we will reserve or carry 25% of annual general fund revenues in reserve, and that is restricted, and that comes right off the top of fund balance of any year. That's really based on recommendation from the Government Finance Officers Association, which said you should have about 3 months of operating expenses in your reserves or rainy day funds. That allows you the flexibility to respond to things like storm expenses. And that's another one. We had $100 and some odd thousand worth of storm expenses that were unanticipated in 2023. We're anticipating about 85% of that coming back in a reimbursement from FEMA, but that didn't happen in the same year that we had the expense. In 2023, for example, we transferred a little over $1.5 million from our ARPA distributions into the general fund to replace lost revenue. But then we allocated all of those dollars to specific projects. So $500,000 to streets, $350,000 to park projects. The Johnson Drive, there were the $200,000 or $250,000 in sustainability projects. There were some classification and compensation. So essentially, that money, we brought it over and we spent it or allocated it all in 1 year. But we held, with a strict interpretation of our current fund balance policy, we held $378,000 in reserves for a one-time revenue that came in 1 year and was spent in 1 year. And so we're seeing more of that. So this year, the number isn't as significant, but we have $140,000 in grant money for the license plate readers. And we have 129 or $130,000 coming back from FEMA. That money's already spent. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to think about having to reserve on those amounts. Next year, if we think about a $500,000 cash contribution from the Millhouse developer, is one time. And it is actually, if you look at your general fund summary page, it's actually assigned in the fund balance below. So if we also include it in reserves, we're actually reserving on that $500,000 twice. Now, for a big city, it wouldn't make any sense to tinker or think about that a little bit differently. For a city like us, every $100,000, $50,000 that we can make available to apply towards council priorities, community priorities, department supplemental requests makes a difference. So I'm interested in feedback on that, but what the general fund summary that it was included in the packet for this evening takes that into account. So it backs down that reserve and backs out anything that is a in and out in the same year, or restricted grant funds that are restricted for a specific purpose that we can't spend on anything else.
Or I think that makes sense. Well, we need to go back and revise the policy, or is there enough flexibility in how it currently is drafted?
I think there's enough flexibility for now, and we can certainly, our intent was we found something else, I think, last year that suggested we probably needed to update that
Okay.
policy. And so we'll bring that back. And I think it's just as simple as clarifying the language in the policy right now says 25% of annual general fund revenues. And I think you would say exclusive of one-time revenues dedicated or committed for a specific purpose to be expended, right? Expended in the same year. Because if we don't spend, again, and so I think we manage that. I think we've protected for the Millhouse, for example, in the same way, it's just a different line item. If I carry the reserve in that 25% fund balance, you all actually have to pass an ordinance to spend the money out of that. I think the intention in the conversations that we've had is, let's assign it. It will still take council action and direction to know how you want to spend it, but there are fewer strings from the auditor's perspective of what happens in restricted, committed, and assigned fund balances. I think Councilmember Chesney had his.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as long as we're looking at the sort of reserve philosophy, haven't we heard in the past that the recommendations are often based on like certain amounts of like months of operating expenses and debt service? And is that something worth considering as long as we're looking at the entire concept?
So I do sort of check that every year. So the GFOA says about 3 months of operating expenses. 25% trends is probably a little bit high for us. It just depends on the month or what we've paid. We don't carry, the only debt service that we carry in the general fund is for the facility conservation improvements. So the debt service reserves, we need to pay more attention to in the funds where street sales tax, parks and recreation sales tax, where we're doing that and paying those expenditures. But yes, all of those things should be factored in, and we do. And we can certainly bring forward and share more detail in the future about how we're sort of estimating that, but we always do the calculations.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, does it make sense to continue using that percentage of reserves versus, codifying some kind of, months of operating expenses standard?
I would say that as long as we're sort of double checking that and truing that up from just a pure tracking and calculation standpoint, picking a set percentage allows me to make a much simpler formula in a spreadsheet to calculate
That makes sense.
that balance. And then I don't have to worry about
Yeah.
changing all those things out. And then if we pull those one-time expenses out, then those are really clear and obvious each year when we do that.
And we have heard from the bond rating agencies before that they like the 25% policy that we have, right?
Right.
They've been doing their assessments.
I was gonna ask about that. I thought even during our credit rating discussions, like 2 or 3 years back, they actually nicked us for having too high of savings. Is that correct? I thought they had recommended even drawing it down a little bit further.
They had, so it's definitely a balancing act. And so we we carried higher fund balances for a couple of years through the pandemic because of uncertainty. I think before we knew what any sort of ARPA distribution might be. We were also, well, starting in about 20, whatever year we had the litigation over the transportation utility fee, we also reserved there not knowing what the outcome of that decision would be. And so we were holding on, and we were able then to use those funds without having to impact operations to pay the class action settlement out of that. We've also reserved for knowing there would be some decision about dark store theory. And so we carried those higher balances. They like us to be consistent with whatever policy we share with them. And so, I mean, many of the cities around us have fund balances in excess of their, of their targets, and they're using those reserves to make adjustments to their classification and compensation systems and things like that. So it is a balancing act. And I think, and we'll touch on this maybe in just a minute. When we think about issuing debt, we want to be really sensitive to and able to explain why our fund balance is what it is and what we're carrying.
I think the staff's done a phenomenal job over the last 3 years in applying for grants and letting us use other people's money, which is a priority for me. I would ask that we look down the road too, as we're doing landscaping projects. We've got nature and conservation. As we're doing, if we do any pervious parking aspects, we've got EPA grants. I ask that we look, every time we're looking into a new project, that we look at usually their environmental impacts, and try and continue to apply for grants. That really has made a difference, I think.
It has. And I think we have definitely, that message has been heard and received, and certainly aligns with our goals and objectives as well. And in fact, I was sitting on a webinar today for a grant program. So I think we are absolutely committed to that. Again, as you said, most of those are available as it relates to capital projects. So we don't see very many of those in our general fund operations. So then I wanted to talk, again, I don't want to go into in depth, but before we get into sort of the supplementals, which are the things that we have more things on a wish list than we have money to spend. And so the cleanest way to look at that comparison is if you look at your general fund summary page and you go to the bottom and you look at the excess fund balance line. And that's sort of, what do we have that is not already committed to something else in the budget? So the materials in your packet, you can see estimated in 2024, about 127,000. And for 2025, 277,000, which is better than what you saw on June 5th, primarily because of the shift of those park maintenance expenses out of the general fund. One of the things that we talked about when we reviewed the 5-year CIP, and particularly the streets and stormwaters, we talked about knowing that we had 2 large projects coming forward in roughly the 2026 timeframe. So we know we have the Johnson Drive from Lamar to Metcalf street improvements, which between design, easement acquisition, and construction we're estimating in the neighborhood of about $14 million. We do have $6 million secured in a surface transportation or STP grant through the Mid-America Regional Council. It will also be a Johnson County CARS project, but still leaves a gap that we have to fund. And then on the stormwater side, we have the Rock Creek Channel improvements from Woodson to Maple, which is estimated, I think, at about I didn't look that number up today, 9.3 million, somewhere in that range. Again, that's been approved for funding by SMAC, but that gap. So I have been working with Bruce Kimmel of Ellers, who's our financial advisor, to look at potential debt scenarios to be able to fund that gap. They're not as clean as I would like them to be, but the bottom line is we can, through issuing sort of debt very conservatively, we can account for those large projects on both the street and the stormwater side with no additional contributions from the general fund or increases in the stormwater utility fee. So that was a big box for me to be able to check and sort of set that aside. We will come back to refining those potential debt scenarios, probably bring something back to you in the fourth quarter of this year to make them as efficient as we can in terms of cost of issuance and those kinds of things. But that was allowed me to take a deep breath, kind of refocus again back on the general fund.
And
Not that we wouldn't like to have more money.
Laura, I was just gonna add in, most of our debt other than related to the CIP has or will roll off before we've be issuing that new debt, right? Had a lot of debt retire recently.
We've had a lot of debt retire recently. We have stormwater debt still because we financed that. Typically, we try to
Okay.
manage our debt issues over a 10-year horizon, and we had some stormwater debt that, because of the life of the asset, stretched out for a longer period of time. But yes, on the street side, well, and you'll remember, we issued in the 2022A issue,
Oh, that's right.
which was
yeah.
split between parks and streets, and it allowed us to kind of close that gap on the Fox Ridge project. And then it has allowed us to accelerate the Waterworks Park improvements and the Mohawk
Right,
Phase 2.
okay.
So we do have those, but again, even with those, and then as I was kind of reviewing the tentative debt scenarios with the mayor, even on the stormwater side, we still have enough excess fund balance that we will be able to continue to address sort of those localized or more neighborhood level drainage issues. And all of that is factored without the special assessment from the Gateway project. So that's, if that comes in at some point in the next 5-year horizon, then we're even that much sort of further ahead.
Yeah, Debbie?
We do have, there's a 63rd Street cars project, the joint project with the city of Prairie Village. The road project that is happening this year is a joint project with Prairie Village, Roland Park, Fairway, and us. But those are primarily the projects. And I think we talked briefly about the Johnson Drive Metcalf Bridge and the KDOT situation. I think we're in the process of sort of sending a response back to them. They've identified that they could make repairs to that bridge somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000 to $600,000, as opposed to the $35 million project that they were looking to fund, and it would extend the life of that for 10 to 12 years. And so we're in conversation with them now to ask them to please proceed with those repairs. And potentially allow us the opportunity to go back through a local consult process. So the Priority Bridge Replacement Program, which they intended to fund this from and had the big miss, we can't go back with that larger project. But this would give us time to really go back and advocate for the design and the direct Johnson Drive access that we would like to see, still maintaining the integrity of that bridge and extending its life for another 10 or 12 years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the smaller supplemental list. I think it was obvious we included the line item budgets for all of the departments in this packet. So as you have a chance to go through that, if you have questions, please feel free to send them our way. So as we kind of try to rearrange and address the highest priority supplemental requests, and I think it was Councilmember Chosey who asked the question last time about why is the fire alarm panel not shown in this budget? We were still sort of trying to pin down costs, which is still a little bit of a work in progress, and that number has increased from what was included on your list the last time. It jumped from about $40,000 to $70,000. And then we had done some air quality testing in this building earlier this year. And there are some things that need to be remediated to address those to the tune of about $50,000. So we've actually shown those as the highest priority supplemental requests and moved those up to 2024. Now they're not included in the base budget. If you look at the math, $120,000. We have about $127,000 in excess fund balance. We should be able to proceed comfortably with both of those projects. And I think both the fire alarm is both of them are really absolutely necessary. I think the first thing that would happen with the air quality remediation is duct cleaning. I'm not sure the ducts in this building have ever been cleaned. And the chief has worked long and hard to get a reasonable price quote to get that accomplished. Then as we move into those things that I think we should consider for 2025, we need to replace the radios in our public works vehicles. To me, that is absolutely an employee safety issue. Network switches is kind of maintains our commitment to the technology investment that we've made. Direction finder survey, we would be on tap to do that survey, which we've done citizen satisfaction survey every 4 years, was last done in 2021. Flooring replacement for PD. This is just really the squad room and supervisors and then sort of back hallway areas. The full-time parks technician, again, that was a recommended. So the PRT recommended adding a second full-time parks maintenance technician in this year's budget. I think our recommendation there would sort of be to hold on that as we kind of look at the shift, make the decisions about the existing costs and what our ongoing needs are going to be. I think we'll have a much clearer picture. And then also, I think working with the department to see if we does having 2 full-time people reduce the need for any of the part-time hours that we're currently paying and trying to come up with what is that right balance. Asset management software and tablets. So Public Works, we've talked a lot about wanting to implement, and it was one of the things that as we went through the Public Works Director interview process that I think Stephanie was most excited about or shared with us about her experience in implementing asset management. This is one where, from my perspective, the asset management software is really supporting primarily our capital program, at least initially on the stormwater and the street side. And so it is not reflected in this budget, but I would recommend that we consider transferring from the stormwater utility about half of that into the general fund and then taking the other half from the property tax that we typically transfer for streets to cover that asset management expense. And then probably going forward, we can then talk about where does the annual software maintenance of that need to live. Exhaust fan for the public workshop. The exhaust fans are original to the building construction in 2007, and I think we're probably reaching that point where those need to be replaced, or at least the carbon monoxide detectors and sensors, but I'm not sure it makes sense to replace. They've far exceeded their anticipated useful life. Floor scrubber for Public Works. Last year, Parks and Recreation got a new floor scrubber, passed their old floor scrubber down to Public Works. As we've talked, this is potentially one that we could sort of hold and wait and see where the revenues come in. Implementation of the 2021 or 2024 IECC or the energy efficiency codes. I had asked staff, and I think I talked about what additional support would we need if we move in that direction to make sure that we're evaluating and applying those. That's still definitely a work in progress, and there is now a grant application that was moving forward earlier this year, sort of hit a holding pattern because they needed the Metropolitan Energy Center was going to be this grant applicant. They found out sort of at the 11th hour, they couldn't be the grant applicant. They needed a city to sponsor that. And they found, I don't know which, so Johnson County has agreed to be that sponsor. So that is back, and there may be, if that grant is approved, these dollars would be available to us through that grant program. Financial management software, we've talked and talked and talked about that one. If there's any way we can figure out how to start moving that forward. And I know Justin and our budget and finance manager, Christine Korth, who very quietly sits on the back row of most of these meetings. I think all of you have met her, have done a lot of work and have been looking at demos and really trying to narrow that down into what would fit. Payroll processing software, we've just had continuing issues with our third-party processor and payroll provider. And we would look to do an RFP and transition. Again, Justin and our HR specialist have been doing demos, but in going back and looking, I think we can absorb that in the existing line item budget. I don't think we need to have supplemental there. And then we would be due on our regular replacement schedule to replace the street sweeper. So the amount shown here is $325,000. We have historically leased that. So that would be spread out probably over a 4-year period, and paid out of the equipment reserve fund, not the general fund. One of the things that I know the department has done in response to the CAP task force, Sustainability Commission, and the council's goals and objectives was research an electric street sweeper. And you probably saw the costs reflected there is about $589,000. I think our recommendation is we will continue to kind of look at what sort of lease rates we could get if we proceeded with that. I don't think we can stretch the life of that sweeper much further. It's about 10 years old and there's just a lot of wear and tear on that equipment. Maybe another year to allow us to research. And I know the Public Works Department has done some preliminary research on just how new are the electric street sweepers, what's, they're operating, how long can they operate on a particular charge, et cetera. So that's one that I think will come back. That's sort of in that holding pattern. We'll continue to do more research. If revenues look better than what we expected, we can probably move forward. So if you really break that down, and I played around with some numbers saying, okay, if we put in, I probably did the math wrong. So I think I played around with what I think are those kind of highest priorities in those numbers, and we're upside down at the end of 2025 by about $30,000. So the likelihood that we can sort of eke out $30,000 here or there is probably pretty good. But be happy, we have about 10 minutes left to talk through any of these other supplemental requests or others that you might be thinking of. I know that Councilmember Kring, I think I put that in the memo, you had asked about the potential for incorporating a line item for storm debris or storm debris removal as a part of each annual budget. So I wanted to put that on the table. I think we've tended to deal with that historically through general fund balance, and to make the call on a, storm by storm basis about whether we're doing curbside pickup, whether we're doing some sort of drop-off facility, or whether we're just asking residents to take care of that. So I don't know, Councilmember Kring, if you wanted to speak to that.
I just had several people commenting to me about the storm debris and how it would be great to have that back again and, make sure the streets are clean and yards are kept okay. And I had several comments about that, so I felt compelled to share that with you.
Sure. I don't know if others have thoughts about, and we've done every iteration in the time that I've been here. So in last July, we contracted and we did curbside pickup throughout the entire community. We have also done drop-offs, and I know many of the cities around us in this last storm or the storms in May had offered drop-off. Our challenge with that is a location to do drop-off. We used to do it in the parking lot at Mohawk Park, which doesn't exist in the same configuration any longer. So I don't know what others.
Yeah, I mean, I had several comments as well from folks wondering if it was going to happen again on some of the more recent storms. And I think it's just one of those things that certainly I want to look at the cost effectiveness of it from a city operations level, but it seems like something that, you know, if you sort of go out and figure what a bunch of individuals and families are gonna pay for, you know, to have their own services to come pick up debris, and then, you know, if you can sort of do that communally, I think it's just makes a big difference in terms of the overall numbers of cost and headache and time. So I think it is for me, it falls under the heading of, I think, a good service that we could provide. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about, you know, how would we look at that in terms of just ongoing funding, and what are the typical costs, and how has that increased over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just really varies
Yeah.
again. And we can pull together some more historical cost of like what a drop off costs us compare. I mean, the challenge that we have with a drop off site is it essentially takes all of our public works staff to manage that. One of the concerns and challenges we had with this last storm is that we were down several positions in the public works department. And so we were concerned about, obviously you want to staff those primarily on a weekend. And being able to do that. So the staffing becomes an issue for us as well as just a location. I think we could solve it potentially for location. But we can pull together some additional costs and just think about whether or not we want to manage that. I mean, if we look at last July between personnel and curbside pickup, so the curbside pickup was about $90,000. And then we were all in for about 150,000 when we looked at personnel costs between the police department and public works associated with that cleanup. We don't get reimbursed for that if it's not declared an emergency or there's not enough damage, both within the county and within the state to accomplish that. So sometimes it's a little bit of a gamble. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Trent.
I was just gonna say, I agree with staff's decision to not implement the curbside pickup on this most recent storm. I just thought that compared to last summer, it made sense to do it then, given the widespread outages that the whole city felt, and, you know, almost every street anecdotally experienced damage. And then this year, this most recent storm, you know, it was a small pocket that experienced severe damage. And I think for us to be an effective purveyor of the curbside pickup, we just need to be mindful of the cost and how, you know, personnel requirements and that sort of thing. And so I would just be in favor of us being cautious about committing to that, and perhaps looking at it as a case by case basis like we've been doing, I think. So I just wanted to kind of voice that side of things.
I don't think that the costs are so excessive that we couldn't handle it out of fund balance and then sort of replace it probably in the next fiscal year. Again, that challenge for us is what is the right amount to put in that line item budget. A little bit, although different. I mean, it's a little bit like our salt budget. So, right, we put $65,000 in the budget for salt every year, and sometimes we spend it and sometimes we don't.
I will
Yeah.
just also say, you've got a lot of elderly people in this community and they need help with things like that. And, you know, the cost measure obviously has to be considered. There's a balancing act. But there's a lot of people who live alone, and getting that cleaned up is a major issue for them. And I
Yeah,
understand that.
and I think we can absolutely do a better job of sort of, it's always difficult for us to kind of coordinate volunteer resources to help with some of that sort of cleanup. And when it is a little bit more sporadic or, you know, not as widespread.
Also, we also have the ability to look at scouts and getting community service hours as well as high schoolers. We've done it before. We did that. a
They
long time
don't-
ago, and it-
We very rarely get anybody who will step up and take
don't
those
have
hours.
them out there.
Yeah, we can still try for that, absolutely. And we will still, you know, ask people that, and I think one of the biggest challenges from a staff perspective is, I mean, literally 30 minutes after the storm blows through, there are people who want to know, what are you doing, right? Are you drop off? Is it curbside? How are we going to handle this? And so it's always this little bit of a dance of like trying to get to that decision reasonably in a timely fashion, because you have some people who, depending on the timing of the week, and I think this one, I think my comment to the chief was, this is the worst kind of storm that happens because it's not widespread. And the timing of it around a weekend was a little bit difficult, but we can continue to kind of refine and bring back some costs, and at least as we work through the rest of the budget process, allow you to make a definitive decision on that.
Yeah, I think Laura too, and I would be okay with the idea of, estimating and saying we'd use fund balance, but I think using as a general guideline, whether or not we think it's going to be a storm that reaches that emergency level, obviously you're not going to accurately predict it and you're going to have to make the expenditures ahead of time. But I think that was sort of what we did with last July's storm, was it was bad enough and widespread enough that we thought there was at least a chance that we would get that large expense,
Yeah.
reimbursed. So I think that is a good guideline.
Well, the other thing you have to do is you have to make the call quickly to get a curbside contractor in place before another city snatches them up. So always a challenge. That's really all I had. And I know we're at our time limit this evening on the general fund. I always appreciate your patience as we, work through and anticipate and revise the budget to get us where we need to be, and, look forward to, I think it's challenging. This is one of those budget years where there aren't a lot of really exciting forward face. Last year we could come out and say, we're giving $500,000 more dollars to the street program. We're giving $350,000 to park. We're doing all of these things with sustainability. This year, it was difficult. It sort of felt uncomfortable initially because it felt like we weren't doing some of those big projects. And then I realized sometimes we have to have the time to catch up to actually implement all those big projects that we want to do. And so as I look at that and I think about the work that staff is doing, looking at electrification of the fleet and a variety of those other things, there's a lot of internally focused things that I think will deliver very forward community facing results in the next year. So with that, I don't have anything else for this evening's work session.
Thanks. That will conclude our work session. Thank you, Laura.